Store owner insults trans woman, then discovers she's his new landlord. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun had barely risen over the city when Ethan unlocked the door to his small boutique. It was a family business, one that had been passed down for generations, and he took great pride in it. He saw himself as a no-nonsense businessman, someone who didn't have time for trends, sensitivities, or what he often referred to as modern nonsense. His clientele was a mix of loyal customers and newcomers, but Ethan had a habit of deciding, within seconds, who belonged and who didn't. If someone didn't fit his idea of a good customer, he would find a way to drive them out, either with dismissive glances or passive-aggressive remarks. So when the bell above the door jingled and a tall woman with striking blue hair stepped inside, Ethan barely hid his disapproval. She had confidence in the way she moved, dressed in a denim jacket and a pink dress, her presence effortlessly commanding attention. She walked to one of the racks, flipping through the selection of clothes, completely at ease. Ethan folded his arms and leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. He had seen people like her before, but different, attention-seeking. He didn't like it. After a few minutes, the woman grabbed a blouse and headed to the counter. She placed it down and offered a polite smile. "How much for this?" she asked. Ethan barely glanced at it. Instead, he looked her up and down, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This isn't your style," he said flatly. The woman's smile didn't waver. "Excuse me? I mean, it's pretty obvious," Ethan said, shrugging. "You're not exactly the type of customer we usually cater to." The flicker of something, annoyance? Amusement, crossed her face. "And what type of customer is that?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "Look, lady, I don't want any trouble. I run a respectable business here. Maybe try one of those trendy stores downtown. I'm sure they have something that fits." Silence stretched between them. For a moment, Ethan expected her to lash out, to argue, to cause a scene. Instead, she chuckled. Not an embarrassed laugh. Not even an angry one. A knowing one. She leaned forward slightly. "That's an interesting way to run a business." Ethan shrugged again, completely unaffected. "I'm just honest." The woman nodded, as if she had just confirmed something. Then, without another word, she picked up the blouse, folded it neatly, and placed it back on the counter. "All right," she said, her voice light. "I'll be back soon." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Doubt it?" She gave him one last look, something unreadable in her expression. Then she turned and walked out, the bell jingling as the door swung shut behind her. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. People these days? Little did he know, this was the last peaceful moment he would have in his store. Because when she came back, she wouldn't be a customer. She would be his landlord. And she was about to change everything. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his store expecting business as usual. He unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and started his routine, checking inventory, preparing the register, and setting up the display window. But something felt off. There was a tension in the air, an unease he couldn't quite place. As he brewed his morning coffee, the bell above the door jingled. Ethan turned around, expecting to see a regular customer. Instead, he nearly dropped his mug. The woman with blue hair stood at the entrance, but this time, she wasn't alone. Two men in suits flanked her, one holding a thick stack of paperwork. Ethan scowled. "You again?" She smiled, calm and composed. "Good morning, Mr. Parker." He narrowed his eyes. "How do you know my name?" The woman stepped forward, pulling a document from the folder in her hands. She placed it on the counter and tapped it twice. "Because," she said, her smile widening, "I'm your new landlord." Ethan froze. He blinked, then let out a sharp laugh. "Nice try." She didn't flinch. The suited man beside her cleared his throat. "Mr. Parker, as of last week, the building was officially sold to its new owner, Ms. Rivera." He gestured toward her. "Your lease agreement is now under her name." Ethan felt the color drain from his face. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. "I've been renting this space for years. The owner wouldn't sell without telling me." Ms. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "Oh, because when I made the offer, The previous owners seemed quite eager to sell. Ethan's heart pounded. He hadn't seen this coming. This woman, the same woman he had dismissed, insulted, and refused service to, was now his landlord. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the counter. "You told me yesterday that you like to be honest. That you run a respectable business?" She tilted her head. "So let's be honest, Ethan. What do you think happens next?" Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "What do you want?" he snapped. Ms. Rivera sighed, as if she had been expecting this reaction. "Well, first, I wanted to introduce myself properly. Since, you didn't give me the chance before." Ethan's jaw clenched. "And second," she continued, sliding another document forward, "I wanted to personally deliver your eviction notice." Ethan's breath hitched. The paper stared back at him, bold letters spelling out notice of eviction. His vision blurred. "No," he muttered. "No, you can't do this." Ms. Rivera smiled, but there was a sharpness behind it. "I can't," she said. "And I already did." Ethan's fingers trembled as he grabbed the eviction notice, his eyes scanning the words over and over again, as if they would suddenly change. But they didn't. This was real. His throat went dry. You can't just throw me out." Ms. Rivera tilted her head. "Actually, I can." She gestured toward the fine print at the bottom of the document. "According to your lease agreement, the new property owner has the right to terminate any ongoing lease with proper notice." Ethan's breath came in short, panicked gasps. "This is my business. I've been here for years." Ms. Rivera gave a small, mocking nod. "Yes, and you've built quite the reputation for yourself, haven't you?" Ethan's stomach twisted. She leaned in, lowering her voice just enough for the moment to sting. "You made it clear I wasn't welcome here. And now, I'm just returning the favor." His pulse pounded. "This is revenge," he spat. "You're doing this because of what happened yesterday?" Ms. Rivera chuckled. "Oh, Ethan, do you really think your attitude yesterday was the only problem?" She pulled another document from her folder, placing it next to the eviction notice. "I did my research. Turns out, you've had complaints filed against you before, multiple times." Ethan's hands balled into fists. "That's a lie." She ignored him. "Your employees have filed reports of discrimination, customers have left reviews detailing your behavior, and let's not forget your little no refunds for certain people policy." She smirked. "I don't think corporate ever caught onto that one, did they?" Ethan felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Ms. Rivera straightened up, her confidence unshakable. "I was going to renovate this place, turn it into something actually welcoming. But now, I think I'll leave it exactly as it is, just with one small change." Ethan's hands shook. "And what's that?" Ms. Rivera picked up the eviction notice and tapped it against the counter. "You won't be here." Silence filled the store, thick and suffocating. Ethan's mind spun. He had spent years running this business his way. He had dismissed people like Ms. Rivera without a second thought. He had felt untouchable. And now he was the one being dismissed. His voice cracked. "Please." It was the first time he had ever begged in his life. Ms. Rivera's expression softened, but only slightly. "I don't think you understand something, Ethan," she said. "This isn't about punishment. This is about accountability." She took one last look around the store. "You never thought about the people you pushed away. Now you get to feel what that's like." She turned, walking toward the door. Ethan stared after her, his heart pounding. He had spent so long deciding who belonged in his store. Now, he was the one being forced out. And for the first time in his life, he realized there was nothing he could do about it. Ethan stood frozen behind the counter, his fingers gripping the eviction notice so tightly that the edges began to crumple. This couldn't be happening. He had built this store from the ground up. Well, technically he had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. But he had been the one to keep it running all these years, to keep the wrong people out, to ensure that only proper customers felt welcome. And now, he was the one being pushed out. His vision blurred as he stared at the paperwork Ms. Rivera had left behind. A 30-day notice. That's all he had. 1 month before he lost everything. His first instinct was to fight back. Maybe he could find a lawyer. Maybe there was some loophole, some way to stop this from happening. He grabbed his phone and frantically searched for lease termination laws. His hands shook as he scrolled through legal jargon that made his head spin. Nothing. Everything in the document was airtight. She had played this perfectly. Still, he wasn't about to roll over and let this happen. He had connections. He had been in this business long enough to know people in city zoning offices, in real estate agencies, people who could pull strings. He would fight this. With a newfound determination, he shoved the eviction notice into his pocket and stormed out of the store, locking the door behind him. The first place he went was to his old friend, Henry Calloway. Henry had worked in real estate for years and had helped Ethan negotiate his lease when he first took over the store. If anyone could find a way to fight this, it was him. Ethan barged into Henry's office without knocking, his heart hammering in his chest. "Henry," he snapped. "I need your help." No. Henry, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked up from his desk, startled. "Ethan?" He frowned. "What's going on?" Ethan slammed the eviction notice onto the desk. "She's kicking me out?" Henry picked up the paper and read it over, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he let out a sigh and placed it back on the desk. "Yeah," Henry said. "I heard." Ethan stiffened. "What do you mean, you heard?" Henry leaned back in his chair. "This has been making the rounds, Ethan. Your new landlord isn't exactly a nobody." Ethan's stomach twisted. Of course. Ms. Rivera was well connected. That's why she had been able to buy the property out from under him so easily. Henry folded his hands. "Look, I know this is a shock, but legally, there's not much you can do. She owns the building now. You're on a month-to-month lease, and she exercised her right to terminate it." Ethan's blood boiled. "So that's it? You're just going to tell me to pack up and leave?" Henry hesitated. "I'm telling you that maybe this is a sign. A sign that it's time to move on." Ethan scoffed. "Move on? From a store that had been in his family for generations? From the only life he had ever known? That's easy for you to say," Ethan snapped. "Your business isn't being stolen out from under you." Henry sighed. "It's not being stolen, Ethan. It's being taken back." Ethan's chest tightened. "What the hell does that mean?" Henry met his gaze. "It means this isn't just about you and Ms. Rivera. You've been running that place the same way your father did. And while that might have worked decades ago, times are changing. People are changing." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You think I'm the problem?" Henry sighed again, rubbing his temples. "I think your store could have evolved. But instead, you refused to change. And now, someone else is taking over." Ethan's vision blurred with rage. He had come here looking for help. And instead, he was being told that this was his fault. He grabbed the eviction notice off the desk and stormed out. If Henry wouldn't help him, he'd find someone who would. His next stop was City Hall. If he could find something, anything, that would slow this process down, maybe he could buy himself some time. He knew people who worked in the permits office. Maybe he could convince them that Ms. Rivera's takeover violated some obscure rule, or that her business license wasn't valid yet. Ethan pushed through the double doors, his mind racing. He approached the front desk, where a bored-looking clerk barely glanced up. "Hi," Ethan said, forcing a polite tone. "I need to speak with someone about a commercial lease dispute." The clerk sighed and handed him a form. "Fill this out. Someone will get back to you in a few weeks." Ethan's temper flared. "I don't have weeks. I have 30 days. I need to talk to someone now." The clerk rolled his eyes. "Sir, we have a backlog of cases. If it's urgent, you can submit an expedited request, but it still takes time." Ethan's hands curled into fists. Time was the one thing he didn't have. He had spent years running his business on his terms, making his own rules. And now, for the first time, he was completely powerless. He left City Hall feeling defeated. His last hope was gone. He had no legal loophole. No powerful connections willing to intervene. And Ms. Rivera? She had won. Ethan returned to the store later that evening. The once familiar space felt different now. It was still his, for now. But it wouldn't be for much longer. He walked slowly through the aisles, running his fingers along the shelves. He had spent his whole life here. Every corner of the shop held a memory, a piece of his past. But none of that mattered anymore, because in less than a month, he would be gone. He turned off the lights and locked up for the night. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. Ethan sat in his car outside the store, staring at the for rent sign in the window. It hadn't been there this morning, but now, as the streetlights flickered on, it stood out like a beacon of his failure. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers gripping so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was real now. There was no way to pretend it wasn't happening. He was losing everything. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text. "Henry, you should talk to her. Swallow your pride before it's too late." Ethan scoffed, shoving the phone face down. Talk to her? What would that do? She had already made up her mind. He had seen the satisfaction in her eyes, the confidence in her voice when she handed him the eviction notice. She wasn't going to change her mind. And even if she did, what would he even say? He had never apologized to anyone in his life. Not sincerely. Apologies were for people who made mistakes, and Ethan never thought of himself as someone who did. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The thought made his stomach churn. Still, he knew he couldn't just sit there and let his store disappear without trying something. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone again, hesitating for only a moment before looking up Ms. Rivera's business contact. And then he called her. The next afternoon, Ethan stood outside the sleek office building downtown, shifting uncomfortably in his shoes. He hated this. Hated feeling powerless. Hated that he was the one waiting. But when the receptionist called his name and led him into a large, glass-walled office, he forced himself to straighten his posture. Ms. Rivera sat behind a dark wood desk, her blue hair neatly tucked behind her ears. She glanced up from a set of documents, offering a polite, unreadable smile. "You called?" she said simply. Ethan cleared his throat. "I want to talk?" She gestured to the chair across from her. "By all means." He sat down, suddenly feeling small in her presence. She leaned forward slightly. "So, what exactly do you want, Ethan?" He swallowed. He had rehearsed what to say a dozen times on the way over, but now that he was here, it all sounded wrong. Still, he forced himself to speak. I just need more time." Ms. Rivera tilted her head. "For what?" "To figure things out," he admitted. "I've put my whole life into that store. You can't expect me to walk away in 30 days. She studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "Ethan, I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't buy that property to ruin you. I bought it because I believe in change. And frankly, your store is outdated in more ways than one." Ethan flinched. She continued. "You could have evolved. You could have built something inclusive, welcoming. Instead, you made it clear who you thought belonged and who didn't." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it cut deep. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know," he admitted. "And maybe I was wrong." That seemed to catch her off guard. She leaned back in her chair, considering him. "Why are you really here, Ethan? Is this about keeping the store? Or is it about finally facing the fact that you might not be the person you thought you were?" Ethan hesitated. He had spent so long thinking he was right, that his way of doing things was the only way. But now he wasn't so sure. Ethan shifted in his seat, his pride warring with reality. Every fiber of his being wanted to fight, to argue, to push back against Ms. Rivera's words. But what was the point? He had spent years telling himself he was in control, that his way of running the store was the right way. And now, he was sitting across from the woman who had taken that control away. He exhaled slowly, staring down at his hands. "I don't know who I am without that store." The words slipped out before he could stop them. It was a truth he had never admitted, not to Henry, not to himself. But now, in front of the very woman he had insulted, dismissed, and underestimated, he was saying it aloud. Ms. Rivera studied him carefully, her expression softening just slightly. "You're more than just a store owner, Ethan," she said. "You just never let yourself see it." Ethan sighed, leaning back in the chair. "So what now?" She was silent for a moment, then reached into her drawer and pulled out a folder. He frowned as she slid it across the desk. "What's this?" She tapped the cover. "An offer." Ethan hesitated before flipping it open. His brow furrowed as he scanned the contents. It wasn't an eviction confirmation. It was something else entirely. His eyes darted back to her. "You're offering me a job?" She nodded. "A management position at one of my new ventures." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "You really think I'd want to work for you?" She raised an eyebrow. "I think you need to work for someone." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I don't take handouts." "This isn't a handout," she said firmly. "It's a choice." He looked down at the paperwork again. The salary was decent. The position was stable. It wasn't his store, but it was something. A way forward. A way to rebuild. Ethan took a shaky breath. "Why are you doing this?" Ms. Rivera's expression softened. "Because someone once gave me a second chance." Silence stretched between them. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Ethan didn't feel completely lost. He had a choice. For years, he had defined himself by what he controlled, by who he let in and who he shut out. But now, someone was offering him a chance to change. And for the first time in his life, he was actually considering taking it. Ethan stared at the contract in front of him, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest. For years, he had been the one in charge, the one making the rules, the one deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, he was being offered a position that put him under someone else's authority, under her authority. His pride screamed at him to walk away. But pride hadn't saved his store. Pride hadn't helped him when he was sitting in City Hall, desperate for a loophole. Pride had gotten him here. He exhaled through his nose, fingers twitching against the desk. "If I take this job," he said carefully, "what's the catch?" Ms. Rivera smirked slightly, tapping her nails against the polished wood. "No catch. Just one condition." Ethan braced himself. "Which is?" She leaned forward slightly. "You listen. You learn. And most importantly," her eyes held his, "you change." Ethan swallowed. This wasn't just about employment. This was about unlearning everything he had built his identity around. It was about stepping into a world he had spent years shutting out. Could he do that? He clenched his jaw, staring at the contract again. "What if I fail?" he muttered. Ms. Rivera tilted her head. "Then that's on you." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "You really think I'm worth saving?" Her smirk softened. "I think everyone has the capacity to grow. The real question is, do you?" The room felt suffocatingly quiet. His whole life had been spent believing in control. That as long as he dictated the terms, he would be safe, untouchable. But he wasn't untouchable anymore. For the first time, he wasn't the one deciding who was allowed to stay. He was the one being let in. And that thought terrified him more than losing the store ever had. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached for the pen. His fingers trembled as he pressed it to the paper. And then he sent. Ms. Rivera nodded in approval, sliding the contract back toward her side of the desk. "Welcome to the team, Ethan." Ethan let out a slow, unsteady breath. Maybe this was the end of his store. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the end of him. Ethan walked out of Ms. Rivera's office, the weight of the signed contract still heavy in his hands. His body moved on autopilot as he made his way back to his car, his mind a whirlwind of uncertainty. For years, he had woken up each morning with the same routine, the same responsibilities, the same sense of control. But now, for the first time in his life, he had no idea what his future would look like. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, his breath unsteady. He had accepted the job. But what did that even mean? Would people look at him differently? Would the employees, his new coworkers, see him as the former store owner who had been forced to bend the knee? Would they even respect him? And more importantly, did he deserve their respect? His hands tightened around the wheel. Maybe Henry had been right all along. Maybe this was a long overdue lesson that he had refused to learn. He sighed, running a hand down his face before finally turning the ignition. It was time to go home. The first day at his new job was a disaster. Ethan had expected it to be uncomfortable, but he hadn't been prepared for just how much everything had changed. For years, he had been the boss, the one giving orders, making decisions, deciding who stayed and who left. But now he was just another employee, taking directions from people he once would have looked down on. The morning started with a company orientation. He sat in a large conference room with a handful of other new hires, some fresh out of college, others with years of experience in the retail industry. They all seemed comfortable, ready to start this new chapter in their lives. Ethan? He felt like a fish out of water. Ms. Rivera entered the room, her usual air of confidence undeniable. She scanned the group before her eyes landed on Ethan, and for a brief moment, he swore he saw a flicker of amusement. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice smooth and professional. "I hope you're ready to learn, because we have a lot to cover." Ethan forced himself to sit still. He wasn't used to being on this side of things. He wasn't used to being the student instead of the teacher. As Ms. Rivera walked them through the company's policies, expectations, and values, Ethan felt a deep discomfort settle in his chest. Everything she spoke about, customer inclusivity, employee respect, diversity initiatives, it all went against the way he had run his store. And yet, it made sense. Looking around, he saw employees who actually wanted to be there. They weren't just working because they had to, they seemed to genuinely believe in the company's values. It was a stark contrast to the environment he had built at his own store. Had his employees ever truly wanted to be there? Had they respected him, or had they just feared him? The thought made his stomach turn. He barely processed the rest of the meeting, because for the first time, Ethan was forced to see himself through the eyes of others. And he didn't like what he saw. Ethan sat through the rest of the orientation in silence, absorbing every word Ms. Rivera said but refusing to let his expression betray just how much it was affecting him. The younger hires took notes, nodding along enthusiastically, while he sat stiffly in his chair, feeling every bit like an outsider. When the session finally ended, Ms. Rivera dismissed the group, but as Ethan stood up to leave, she called his name. "Stay back for a moment." His stomach tightened, but he nodded, waiting until the others had exited the room. She leaned against the table, crossing her arms. "So, how are you feeling?" He hesitated. Was this another test? He exhaled sharply. "Like I don't belong here." She tilted her head, watching him carefully. "And why is that?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "Because everything you're saying, everything you stand for, it's the complete opposite of how I ran my store." Ms. Rivera nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "And do you think that's a bad thing?" Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Well, considering I'm the one sitting here as an employee while you're running the show, yeah. It's pretty clear who was doing things wrong." For the first time since meeting her, he saw something unexpected in her expression. She didn't look smug. She didn't look triumphant. She looked understanding. "Ethan, I didn't bring you here to humiliate you," she said gently. "I brought you here because I think you have the potential to change." He scoffed. "But why do you even care?" Ms. Rivera exhaled, running a hand through her blue hair. "Because I was once in a position where someone gave me a chance to be better." Ethan frowned, caught off guard by her honesty. She continued, "I wasn't always the person I am today. I had my own blind spots, my own mistakes. But someone called me out on them and gave me the opportunity to learn. I could have doubled down. I could have refused to change. But instead, I listened." She held his gaze. "And now, I'm giving you that same opportunity." Ethan's throat felt tight. This whole time, he had assumed she wanted to see him fail, to watch him squirm as karma delivered its final blow. But that wasn't it, was it? She wasn't offering him this job to punish him. She was offering him a chance to be something more than the man he had been before. He swallowed hard. "What if I don't know how to change?" Ms. Rivera smiled slightly. "Then it's a good thing you're in the right place to start learning." For the first time since signing the contract, Ethan felt something other than resentment. For the first time, he felt hope. Ethan left the conference room feeling more conflicted than ever. Everything about this situation still felt wrong. The power shift, the new job, the way Ms. Rivera spoke to him like he was some lost cause she was trying to rehabilitate. And yet, for the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking off a cliff into complete nothingness. Change. That word had haunted him since the moment Ms. Rivera took over his lease. He had fought against it, resisted it, convinced himself he didn't need it. But now, standing in the middle of this new office, surrounded by people who work together like a team instead of as isolated employees waiting for orders, He wondered if he had spent his whole life resisting something that was always inevitable. Maybe change wasn't the enemy. His first day on the job was brutal. He had never worked under anyone before, not really. Even when he had taken over the family store, he had always been the one in charge. He had never had to answer to anyone, never had to prove his worth. Here, he was just another employee. He had been assigned to a training manager named Julia, a woman in her early 30s with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of humor. She had clearly been told about his past, but if she had any judgments, she kept them to herself. "All right, Ethan," Julia said as she handed him a schedule sheet. "You'll be shadowing me for the next 2 weeks, learning how we do things here. Then, if I don't think you're a total lost cause, you'll get some independence." Ethan let out a small, half-hearted laugh. "No pressure." Julia smirked. "Relax. You'll survive." She led him through the office, explaining the company's structure, how they handled customer service, and their policies on employee treatment. "We have a strict no discrimination policy," Julia explained as they passed a group of employees collaborating on a new storefront project. "Anyone caught treating a customer or a coworker unfairly because of race, gender, orientation, you name it, is out. No warnings." Ethan stiffened slightly but nodded. Julia studied him for a moment before continuing. "And just so you know, we don't tolerate power-tripping managers either. Everyone here is expected to be a leader, not a dictator." Ethan exhaled, already feeling the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. He had spent so many years believing that authority meant control, that leadership was about being obeyed. But this place? This was different. People worked together. They shared ideas, they listened, they respected one another. And the worst part? It actually worked. For years, Ethan had believed his way was the only way. But now, as he watched this team operate like a well-oiled machine, he was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Maybe leadership wasn't about power. Maybe it was about trust. And if he wanted to survive in this job, he needed to start earning it. Ethan's first week on the job was humbling in ways he hadn't expected. He had thought the hardest part would be adjusting to not being the boss. But in reality, it was unlearning everything he had built his leadership style on. He had always run his store like a dictatorship. Orders were given, rules were followed, and if someone didn't like it, they could leave. Simple. But here, things worked differently. Julia expected him to ask questions, not just assume he had all the answers. She challenged him to actually listen before making a decision. And worst of all, she made him sit in on customer service calls. "Every employee, no matter the position, has to understand the foundation of what we do," Julia had told him. "And that means starting at the most important level, the customers." Ethan had rolled his eyes at first. He had spent years dealing with customers. What could possibly be different about these calls? As it turned out, everything. He listened as employees handled difficult customers with patience. He watched as they de-escalated tense situations without resorting to dismissiveness. He saw them treating people with respect, even when those people didn't deserve it. And for the first time, Ethan realized how much of his old job had been fueled by power, not service. He had never cared about his customers, not really. He had cared about control. But here, respect wasn't just an expectation, it was the foundation. He sat in silence as Julia turned to him after one particularly tense call, where an employee had calmly resolved an issue without raising their voice once. "What do you think?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say that he wouldn't have wasted so much time on a difficult customer, that back at his store he would have just told them to take their business elsewhere. But something stopped him, because deep down he knew that approach had cost him everything. So instead, he sighed and muttered, "I've got a lot to learn." Julia smirked. "That's the first smart thing you've said all week." Ethan rolled his eyes, but for the first time since stepping into this job, he didn't feel like an outsider. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to get it. Ethan's second week on the job felt different. The first week had been a brutal wake-up call, forcing him to confront everything he had done wrong in his past role. But now, for the first time, he wasn't just going through the motions. He was trying. Instead of tuning out during training, he listened. Instead of brushing off feedback, he actually considered it. And instead of assuming he knew better, he started asking questions. Julia noticed. "All right, Parker," she said one afternoon as they wrapped up a store operations session. "I have to admit, I expected you to crash and burn." Ethan scoffed. "Wow. Thanks for the vote of confidence." She smirked. "But you're adapting." "Slowly, but it's happening," Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, apparently I needed a reality check." Julia leaned against the counter, studying him. "So what's next for you? You just gonna keep your head down and coast through? Or are you actually gonna take this seriously?" Ethan paused. That was the real question, wasn't it? At first, he had taken the job because he had no other choice. But now he didn't hate it. More importantly, he didn't hate the person he was becoming. "I think I want to see where this goes," he admitted. Julia nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Because Ms. Rivera's been watching?" Ethan stiffened. "She what?" Julia grinned. "Oh yeah, she checks in on all new hires, but you're her personal project?" Ethan groaned. "Great." Julia laughed. "Relax. She's not waiting for you to fail. She's waiting to see if you can actually grow." Ethan's stomach twisted, because for the first time, he wanted to prove that he could. A month later, Ms. Rivera called him into her office. Ethan sat across from her, feeling less defensive than he had the first time. He wasn't sure when that had changed, but it had. She folded her hands on the desk. "I've been hearing good things." Ethan shrugged. "I'm trying." Ms. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "That's more than I expected when you walked in here." He let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, turns out I wasn't as right about everything as I thought I was." She smirked. "That's a start." Silence settled between them before she leaned back slightly. "I meant what I said before, Ethan. I didn't bring you here to punish you. I brought you here because I believe people can change." Ethan met her gaze. And for the first time, he believed it too.